And hello. Hi, everybody. So it's gonna be
Hello.
a week between these two episodes. We got Mr. Hadaki here today. Um,
Just David. It's good.
oh, David, today, and we've had so much to discuss last week, and I had this rare opportunity to do like a back-to-back podcast. I thought, you know what, let's go for it. There's so much stuff happening within the education field right now, and we didn't even get to the subject of like, say, like CRT, or at least the use of that term CRT in schools and things like that. And um I and probably want to hit on certain things about maybe the future of education and educators, and the hopes that we have. Like me understanding this past year and a half how much work goes into teaching, and
Yeah.
you mentioned it before last week, is that the beginning of the pandemic is like there's so much love and respect for educators, but now all of a sudden things are kind of getting weird lately.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I mean, this is the perfect segue to talk about critical race theory,
Mm-hmm.
because that has become, in my view, and I think in the view of a lot of people that are way smarter than me and write about this kind of stuff, um, the like a rallying cry
Mm-hmm.
for not I would argue like not just the extreme right wing, but
Mm-hmm.
even people that are maybe more along the moderate side of the spectrum, which by the way, I mean, I always start even with my kids that I don't even like the dichotomy of left and right.
Mm-hmm.
I think it just having that perspective is detrimental to the conversation because it's your left, your right, that's me, that's you.
It kind of goes back to that conversation we had last week. Well, I
Mhm.
mean yesterday, but as you, the
Or last
audience,
week.
last week,
Yeah.
is that like there is this notion of like tribalism, and I think
Hmm.
that's kind of ingrained in us, that there's like we have to find communities that we think and are the same.
Yeah.
And I think for me personally, it's like the way to kind of get out of that is always be curious, always be a student, always be someone that always questions. And I think that's like kind of like that pedagogy is just like being that person that's always constantly like, oh, this is how I've been taught, but maybe there's a new better way.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I've been working on trying to make sense of this just in my head,
Mm-hmm.
um, since it's become a big issue, and I think so. On the first level, what is critical race theory, right? That's in my view, uh, all it is in the academic fields the recognition that we have to recognize the
Mm-hmm.
history of racism in the United States.
Right.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
So with that goes, we could look at in my particular field. Um, I would highly recommend Lies My Teacher Told Me to anybody. Lies My Teacher
Right.
Told Me by James Lowen. He rest in peace. He just passed away. I want to say 2 months ago. Definitely this school year.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a big influence on me. Um, and Lies My Teacher Told Me, if you haven't read it, what he does is he picks apart at that time 12 the top 12 American history textbooks in the country, high school history textbooks,
Right.
and just points out inaccuracies, deficiencies, exaggerations, all of it. And the reality is there is a political motivation to constructing a narrative that takes out racism
Mm-hmm.
to the point that how is it to this day we are still even having a debate like about the Civil War,
Mm-hmm.
that it was about slavery, like the whole like that period, end of story.
Mm-hmm.
The Civil War was about slavery. That's it. I mean, as the historian, you could look at the historical record, you could look at the speeches, primary sources of the people involved, you can
Mm-hmm.
look at the Confederate Declaration of Independence. They are telling the world that they are superior
Mm-hmm.
racially, and that's why they must break away. So
Yeah.
how do we get this denialism? Well,
I
it's because part of it, in my view, there's this left and right dichotomy that we have to fit into,
mm-hmm.
and I think to I if I I think when in the recent years, in recent push for social justice, racial equity, I think there are people on that side of the argument that say, but I'm not racist. I'm just trying to be a good person, and I feel like I'm on the defensive.
Mm-hmm.
And now those people that were potential allies, in my view, are now becoming opponents.
Mm-hmm.
And critical race theory is being used as the rallying cry.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, and your teachers are just teaching your kids, if they're white, they're teaching them to hate themselves. If they're black, they're teaching them uh, to rise up with violence against the system. And none of that's true, but if enough people believe something,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes I don't want to say it becomes true, but it becomes um, the narrative, and it becomes now we on our end have to respond to that
Yeah.
and have to operate in a system that now has to deal with that,
Yeah.
regardless of true or not.
Well, it's kind of like a part of my classic movie education. It's like that the line on Who Shot Liberty Valance, right? If the legend is yeah, much more tantalizing than the truth, you print the legend, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like CRT, at it being a theory, and the theory by definition is not law, right? If you're looking at it from a scientific point of view, right?
Mhm.
It's a way to kind of like foster a conversation. But CRT is not necessarily being taught in schools, right?
No.
And I think what had happened through the social uprisings, of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and also like Ahmaud Arbery's trial and the
Yeah.
horrid situation with the jury is happening in real time right now. But I think that aside is like there is a kind of like reckoning or a recognition, both in an earnest way, to at least talk about it, to at least address it. And I think a lot of school districts have been trying to find ways to do that, or trying to find ways to at least have a conversation. Because if this is what students are trying to get across, then it should be through the educators. What are some ways for us to talk about it? I think. And this is me, like, I'm more outside looking in
Mhm.
than what you would experience as like an educator, kind of boots on the ground, sort of
Mhm.
mentality, right? So this is how I would see it.
Well, I mean, I could teach a more authentic
Mm-hmm.
history without ever saying the words critical race theory.
Right.
In fact, it's one of the critiques I see out there, like that's a grad school thing.
Right.
That's not
In law
a
school too.
yeah, that's
I
not a high
heard.
school thing. And
Yeah.
and in my teacher ed program, like
Mm-hmm.
to me, in my discipline, it's critical pedagogy, and it's
Mm-hmm.
challenging old notions of education. One of the pioneers is Paolo Freire,
Mm-hmm.
who pushes back against what he calls the banking model of education. This idea that you, the student, are an empty vessel, you know nothing, and my job as the teacher is to fill you with knowledge, and content knowledge, not necessarily wisdom or not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily critical thinking skills, but here, memorize all this history. And I mean, think about what history was when we were in high school. Most of my history classes were you listen to a teacher lecture 4 days a week, you take a test on the fifth day,
Mm-hmm.
and that was it. And James Lowen, in Lies My Teacher Told Me, addresses that too. For so long, it hasn't been on the cusp of pedagogy. It was something that the PE coaches did on the side. It was something that was a throwaway, and um, I mean, even when it comes to our credential, you could have a credential in anything past the C set in history, and that's you've proved that you can teach history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whereas I think my training as a historian, as a social scientist, is pivotal in understanding the the subject and being able to teach it in a way
Mm-hmm.
that is more critical in terms of critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And
and
like I see.
we see that effect to this day. Like I mentioned earlier, like how is it that we can't we're having this debate about something as cut and dry as the cause of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you're trained, if you have some rudimentary training in historical thinking and looking at the historical record and what that means to research and what that means to try to understand cause and effect
Mm-hmm.
and what it would take to mobilize two huge armies over what kind of an issue would that be? You know what I mean? It becomes more and more nuanced, and that to me is the need to really update at least the way a lot of teachers,
Mm-hmm.
if they're more of the old school kind of lecture bubble test persuasion when it comes to history, like we got to get away from that. Like it's such a rich subject, and but that in a lot of ways is the remnants of standardized testing driven education.
Mm-hmm.
There was XYZ we had to get through, and in my class I have never once finished all the content standards.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never been shy about saying that to any administrator, any person in power in my district, because I've been of the perspective: you come to my classroom and tell me that my kids aren't learning, and then I'll change accordingly. But if you come to my classroom and we're doing something unconventional and kids are engaged, kids are learning, you could ask them yourself, then what's the problem?
Right. Right.
You know what I mean? Um, and so in my view, critical race theory as a hot button topic, it's just the latest thing that gets people to the polls
Right.
before an election, and we saw it last night. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I'm a big fan of Daily Show, and you know they
Definitely
have
same.
plenty of and going back to like the old school Jon Stewart criticizing Iraq days. And let's circle back to Iraq after I finish this point, because
Mm-hmm.
it illustrates something interesting to me.
Right.
But and granted, they're interviewing a lot of people, and they show a certain amount because it's funny, it's comedy.
Mm-hmm.
But repeatedly, I think it was Jordan Klepper asking, like, so what is critical race theory? He's like, I don't know, but I know it's the worst thing ever, and we have to stop it. And I know it's just a couple guys saying that, but that has to be more indicative, because how is this? I mean, you have congressmen who on the floor of the House will have made an argument in recent years that slavery wasn't that bad.
Mm-hmm.
They were housed, they were fed. It wasn't that bad. And it's just like, are you kidding me? That's the level of ignorance, or not ignorance, but manipulation and deception
Mm-hmm.
is craven.
Yeah. And
So
it's like it got to the point where like even one of the top generals of the United States were like, if this is going to be affecting us as a unit, we should learn it, right? If it I have my reservations about Milley and in general, I guess folks in higher power, but it's like he's right. Like if this as a leader, and he sees himself as a leader, I need to understand what it is and how can I change accordingly, because if this is affecting my subordinates or anybody under me, I have to understand this as a leader, right?
well, and that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. It doesn't matter what he says. It's about a narrative that's constructed
Right.
by a conservative media, a corporate media whose
Mm-hmm.
job is to get people constantly angry so they can keep watching, keep buying the products that are on the commercials, and keep coming out to vote.
Getting those
So
eyeballs, right? And getting
yeah,
people to continue seeing. Yeah.
so think about that. Milley, he's what, 4-star Army general?
I need to
Or is he
double
Air
check
Force?
that.
I think he's Air Force.
Okay.
I should know this, but I don't have it at the ready. If I was in class, I would ask the kid, "Hey, fact check me real quick."
Yeah, same.
I'm serious. I'm never gonna be like I know everything. I don't have Nobody has a monopoly on the truth.
Hmm.
but he's either Army or Air Force. But the point I'm trying to make is that now the conservative wing is openly criticizing him. And it's like, if you are of the left, if you are of the liberal, and you criticize any aspect of the military, you are dubbed, you're dragged through the dirt, and you're dubbed as anti-American, X, Y, and Z. And if for some reason, if you're on the right wing and you find fault in the military, uh, you're standing up for your country, and you're
Hmm.
speaking truth to power and all that stuff. And that's what I was gonna talk about when it comes to Iraq.
Hmm.
Like the the Iraq War on its onset was opposed, at least on the grassroots level, by the left wing. Let's call it the left wing.
Hmm.
And now it's common for more right wing types to be critical of the Iraq War. I mean, even Donald Trump was one to distance himself and say, like, there was it was wrong, it was ill-minded, and all kinds of mistakes were made, and things
Hmm.
like that. So it we're seeing that we're at a place where it's not about the logic, it's not about the reason, it's about the feeling.
Hmm.
and and I'm not sure how to push back on that.
Hmm.
um, I know part of the solution is education, so I keep doing what I do, but I don't know if it's enough, especially now that you know so much is out, so much misinformation is out there on social media, easily accessible. I had, was it 4 years ago? I mean, I think now maybe 3 years ago. And it was in the first weeks of school, so it might have been a student sort of asserting themselves and just challenging the teacher and having fun with it. But I I was debating flat Earth with a student, and I was just
Oh
like,
wow.
how is that a thing? How is that a thing?
Hmm.
And that was around the time, it was a Kyrie Irving that said it.
I think it was around that
Um,
time. Yeah.
yeah. So whenever that happened, it was fresh. And if it's a dumb idea, but it gets enough clicks, it becomes well known, and then it becomes talked about, and then it
Hmm.
becomes something that you as an educator have to address, whether it's in the classroom or at the union organizing level. Here we are.
Yeah, there's
And
almost like no perception of irony anymore. It's like
mm,
it's not just doing things for parody. If you do it, it is the thing. I think I've heard it before. It's like I know this is super old, but like if you just say YOLO and like kind of like in a TikTok trend, or it's just, or like even before that it was Vine. Like even though you're doing it ironically, you're still doing the thing.
mm,
You're still doing that trend and all of those things. So I always tell folks about that. It's like sometimes, if just watch what you're doing, just check yourself at the door, just making sure that you're not just doing it just for the sake of doing things, right? Yeah. And like you're understanding where it comes from, you're understanding what's happening.
could we pause real quick?
Yeah.
Did I hear like a beep on through this, or is it something outside?
I
Because
don't
I'm
think
hearing
I heard,
the dogs barking like crazy outside.
I haven't heard anything.
Let me check this. Mic's not well.
It's a little matrix situation.
Right, right.
Fourth
As
movie
we
coming
talk
out.
about all these things, have you ever seen? There's this documentary called "Why We Fight," and I don't know if you want to hit record again. I think I'm just overreacting to.
Oh, no problem. Why we fight? Isn't that on HBO right now, or is that something else, like a different streaming site? I've heard of it
Um,
before.
oh, you were recording the whole time.
Yeah, I'm still recording the whole time.
It's fine.
I could edit it out.
Yeah, yeah. "Why We Fight" is, I'm not sure if it's on HBO. I actually have it on DVD. I have two copies of it on DVD.
Hmm.
Really good documentary on exploring sort of the military industrial complex. It
Mm.
starts with Eisenhower's speech, and it has a whole lot of really high level players from like John McCain like Paul Wolfowitz and some of the architects of the Iraq War. Who was the national security advisor at the time?
Was it Colin? It wasn't. Was it Colin
It
Powell?
wasn't Colin Powell.
No, he was the Secretary of State at the time. Yeah,
Yeah, it was.
I
I'm
think I
blanking on
remember.
the name.
Yeah,
I'm
he was
blanking on the name.
also quoted saying that it was a mistake recently to go into like even Afghanistan, right? I think it was like the same security advisor that has said that
I hadn't.
recently.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Oh, really?
I'd have to get my facts straight
Yeah,
before
same here.
going
I'm
too much
just
into that.
trying to remember. My brain is
But
mush.
yeah, but the reason I thought of it was in the documentary, John McCain's being interviewed,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the like the good John McCain that showed up to that one. Like later on, he gets a little xenophobic, and
Mm-hmm.
but early John McCain is somebody that had a lot of good ideas, and I think had a good heart for the most part. He was pro-immigrant, sort of not anti-military, but like let's make sure we use military power in a way that's just, all that stuff. Anyway, he's basically being critical of the war, and he's even raising the question of war profiteering, etc. In the documentary, his phone rings and it's the vice president's office. Like during filming. And then he's live on, or he's on camera, he's like, oh, it's the vice president's office, let me go answer that. And it's just, yeah, coincidence, maybe, weird, yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, like we just talked about, there's weirdness happening outside as we're talking about heavy stuff. So
Yeah, and it makes me want to think about like historians speak of like how are we going to write this chapter in American history. Like I think this has been like kind of like an earth-shattering 18 months from like the social ills of racism of like George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then even to the point of like dealing with deep-seated like Asian American hate, right? That this idea of model minority bubbling up to the surface, right? I think for me, even dealing with my own family's ideas of anti-blackness, right? Understanding where that comes from,
yeah.
where we benefit, and things like that. And it's just like I've been kind of hyper aware and understanding, but I don't know if anybody else has been hyper aware and understanding of that. So I was just like, in your mind, as someone that's like a social scientist, like historian to a degree, do you think that we will be measured in like how we record this point in time?
Um, I'd only be guessing,
Yeah.
only because this is unprecedented.
Right.
Because it is so many things happening at the same time, amplified by social media. So social media now becomes part of the historical record.
Mm-hmm.
So future historians, would have to, I imagine, like sift through this historical record, and you got to imagine a historian almost in the role of an archaeologist digging through the historical records and knowledge of the time
Mm-hmm.
and coming up with a conclusion. And now that there's just so much, there's more information than can be consumed in a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So how does one person construct that narrative? Well,
Mm-hmm.
they can choose. How does a team of people? Well, now they'll bring their own perspectives and biases to that narrative. So I mean, and that's why historical thinking is such an important thing to actually teach in the high school level, I think,
Mm-hmm.
because the reality is, uh, my U.S. history class for 11th grade is the last time a lot of those kids are going to be asked to think about history
Mm-hmm.
in a, definitely in a classroom, but in a, an academic way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, 12th grade is government econ, and yeah, of course there's overlap, but that might be their last history class. in their lives. You know, the math points to that. At the very most, 40% of our graduates are going to end up at a college, at a
Mm-hmm.
university, and that's just the math, right?
Yeah.
And I don't celebrate that. I think it's sad, especially now,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the truth. So, like, YouTube to a future historian is going to be,
The
or do you just
primary
ignore it,
source. Yeah.
right? Or do you just
Yeah.
ignore it? Do you go off more news, off more academic writings?
Mm-hmm.
But then even that skews the narrative. So I don't know. I'm only speculating, just spitballing here. Like, what's going to be the story of the 2000, end of the 2000 teens? You know what I mean? And into
Mm-hmm.
2020. Um, we'll see. Time will tell.
I always try to hope and lean towards the positive. I guess
Hmm.
this is more of like, this is the part of me that's always been the constant optimist. And I, even in looking into the darkness, the dark soul of America, right, the United States, I think that there is a light to that, right? Like, understanding it means that as a citizen you can also like put people to account. Just say like, hey, this is what happened, right? The Bracero program really screwed things up. We got to
Hmm.
make sure we don't do that same mistake again. All right. Or halting immigration, that didn't work out. Like, how do we make sure to not make those same mistakes? And I don't know, maybe this is like my Apple box soapbox sort of idea about history. But I think I try to be like that old mentality of like, if we don't understand our past, we're just doomed to kind of like constantly, like, over and over again, just make those same mistakes happen.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. And I don't know if I call myself optimistic, but I do call myself stubborn.
Mm-hmm.
And to continue to kind of resist a negative narrative is my stubbornness. And it's not because I'm like Pollyanna in it, or anything like that. Because I can, I can look at the way things are and fall into some despair, because
Mm-hmm.
it seems wacky sometimes, to say the least. Um, but like we talked about last week, uh, sometimes, and then you, in those moments, you tend to get something that reminds you of why it's important that you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So like right now we're, and to your point, or to which, like right now we're in my U.S. history class, we're doing this mock constitutional convention, and it's written by the Zen Education Project. So when I heard when I heard Donald Trump say the name Howard Zinn, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like they're fine, and this is right before CRT became the buzzword. This might have been, it was early pandemic too, um, but he's like, there's this historian Howard Zinn, and they're being taught this stuff, and they're being taught to hate America, and it's like, well, uh, no. But anyway, so I'm on a tangent. The lesson comes from that, and in it,
Mm-hmm.
they're looking at, um, we're recreating the Constitutional Convention. The kids are in different parties, and they can advocate for their positions. And just in looking at the Constitution, it's like, it's a flawed document that has racism written into it, but it
Mm-hmm.
also provides this framework, eh, to be, in later generations, exploited for the cause of social justice. And that's the kind of nuance that also gives me hope. Like, and lets me appreciate, despite the fact that they were, you know, very flawed individuals, to say the least,
Right.
that wrote that document.
Well, I think
Also,
that's what we gotta look into our leaders, right? I think never see your idols, right? I think that a lot of people talk about that. Never meet your celebrities, right? um people are people, right? And and given time, right, people can be of that time.
And
um
it's a good example of how I was kind of saying earlier, it's not about the logical argument. It's
mhm,
about sort of like, this is what my team believes. So on the right, there is this narrative of like the founding fathers of being these wise old white men that were, even quasi religious figures.
deified, yeah.
They are deified, and there's this notion of constitutional purity, and we can't change it because it's perfect.
Mhm,
And I always point out to my kids, well, within it, A is written slavery and other forms of oppression, but B, within it is written the mechanisms for which to change it.
mhm,
And now there's this logical feedback loop, like, okay, it's perfect, and that perfection shows us how to change it, but we can't change it because it's perfect.
mhm.
But it's perfect, and it tells us how to change it. It doesn't have to make sense. It just has to get people angry enough to to vote Republican. you know,
And I
that's
figured
it.
there's a lot of very much progressive individuals. Like, honestly, if I had back episodes on housing, right, I'm sure my audience kind of lean towards that. But it is an imperfect document. I feel like, in my mind, it's like the most human of documents, because I think there is that classical chance, religion does play into it, but like that idea of like people can change, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's written into that document, that
Yeah, in
over
order to
time.
form a more perfect union.
Yeah.
It's telling you right there in the first sentence.
Hmm. And
Like,
I always think about this, and I always thought it would be very interesting. It's like, if you had a thought experiment, if you thought, if you found a way to bring back the founding fathers, I think it would be just much of an insult for them to say 200 and a half years and you didn't really change much. I was like, I'm really surprised, or something like that, that I
it's
always play
funny.
that thought
Yeah,
experiment with my friends.
and I know uh, I could say I'm still a fan. I know he's said some things in recent months that it's just like,
Oh,
but
Chappelle.
no, Joe Rogan.
Oh, Joe Rogan. Oh, yeah, yeah, same.
He's got a bit on that where your exact premise right now, and
Hmm.
they'd be like, "What the fuck? You didn't change anything?" It's like, we wrote this thing with a feather. Like, okay,
I think I might have subconsciously remembered that bit.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But to your point, like, he's not perfect,
Hmm.
and how, to judge him, to judge anybody to an extreme degree
Yeah,
because
same
of
thing. i
opinions that
was
you disagree.
i was also thinking about, I was talking to my dad, because we're reading Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and people that were alive back in the 60s. And I just thought to myself, is like, I can't imagine Martin Luther King being with on the subject of the LGBTQ issues, right? I can't imagine
Hmm.
Malcolm X, that was, I think, politically very right in his beliefs as a Muslim, that he would be up with, some of these social things that we're finding now, and I think that those are just kind of the things, as like, I still revere those, social justice leaders, but I also understand, you know, we still live in a continuum, right? And I
Yeah.
think we'll continue to find, things that, they're imperfect human beings, and
Well,
I
and
don't know.
and
Yeah.
I think in my view, and
Yeah.
maybe this is an unpopular opinion, I think there is something to be said about maybe an overreach or a wrong approach, a wrong-minded approach in some ways to the cause of social justice.
Hmm.
Um, like, we can't say the tribalism exists on the right without acknowledging that it exists on the left as well.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, like, Chappelle's an excellent example. I watched that whole thing, and I didn't come away with him being transphobic.
Hmm.
To me, it's like, some of the analysis I read, it's like, did you read the whole thing, or did you watch the whole thing?
Hmm.
Because his message in the end is like forgiveness, and in some of the other one of his other specials. I was homesick with the flu,
Hmm.
and it was right when it came out. And I actually went back and I just watched all of them, and I was in bed reading some of the. So I kind of took a deep dive into the
Hmm.
Chappelle controversy a couple weeks back. Um, One of the other specials, he talks about building, reaching out to imperfect allies, because no one's if you're only there's no reason for what am I trying to say? So like the idea of you're isolating people that are mostly on your side because they don't see one thing exactly the same way you do,
Hmm.
and you don't give them room to be wrong, room to grow, room to even ask questions sometimes. So we and I'm seeing it. I see it. I feel like every year I do this political survey in my class, sort of like as a way to model discussion and things like that. And I'm seeing it. Kids are getting more conservative.
Hmm.
And one of the truths I think I've come to understand is like one thing that's making people more conservative is liberals.
Hmm.
Um, we're not we're not bringing people in. We're pointing at people. And I say we, even though I just kind of talked about I don't even like the dichotomy, but
Hmm.
you know the approach to some is point your finger, judge, shun, cancel, for lack of a better word, and
Hmm.
that doesn't build alliances. That doesn't get people on your side.
Well,
It
yeah,
might
that.
feel good in the short term,
Hmm.
right? It might even get attention on social media.
It hits that dopamine
Oh yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
reward system, and it's almost like and then you go back to it's like it's there's no space to learn or
Mm,
grow. And I think there is like I don't qualify myself as religious, but I think that there is a place where if you are willing to learn, right, willing to change, and I think that there's got to be that hand out there to kind of like pick you up
mm.
when there's a fall. I think that might be a very classical way of thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I see
I
what you
guess
mean.
I'm dancing around the idea of like, this is like a very base idea of like Christian values, right? You really hope that people can change and do these things, but I don't know. Maybe I am hopeful, but I don't know if we got out of that scarlet letter phase in kind of our collective lizard brains.
I hope. I mean, and to your point, like I think, I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic school for elementary and high school.
Hmm.
It was around my junior year that I decided that I'm not Catholic,
Hmm.
and that's when like a whole lot of the church, like the misdeeds were coming out,
Right.
and I was just starting to really like think critically about the world. I think um, before that, I don't remember caring about anything beyond my little awareness, almost like going through the world with tunnel vision, not out of animosity, just ignorance, and I was just a kid. Um, but it stays with me. I think I still I'm maybe like a non-religious Catholic.
Hmm.
Uh, some of those teachings of compassion, of forgiveness.
Hmm.
They still stay with me, and then a lot of the iconography too. I like, especially the Mexican Catholic iconography. Like I still vibe with. I still have a cross in my home and a Vade hand, and
Hmm.
it's nostalgia. It takes me back to my parents,
Hmm.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's also a reminder, like be good to people even if they're not going to be good to you.
Hmm.
Try, and then if you fail, then forgive yourself and move on.
Hmm.
And that's what I mean. Like the Chappelle, like he in the closer, he is talking about forgiveness. And did the people that are writing the editorials in the Atlantic and LA Times and all that stuff, did they watch the whole thing?
Hmm.
Did they cherry pick?
Right.
Um, or did they see a chance to amplify one thing because there's a segment of the online information consuming population that will click on that? Because
Hmm.
or probably a combination of those three things. But if the social justice movement makes Chappelle the enemy, then we're in trouble. I
Right.
think. I think.
Yeah. Well, it's like within those 18 months he could release something like 8 854, right? Like that special where he describes, where he says specifically, I should not have to be Dave Chappelle to survive a police encounter,
Mm.
and it wasn't necessarily a comedy
No, yeah, it
set,
was. He
you
had very
know,
few jokes in that bit.
very few jokes in that kind of 15 minutes, but he makes a lot of salient points. And I think even before the closer, the two specials where he had that initial joke about the trans community, and then he goes back and really thought about the joke he did, and then comes back and just says, like, I really needed to think about what I said at that moment. And he does say it in like his comedy way, but also brings up a point. It's like it's a part of me needing to learn about this. And I think the closer, I actually need to watch it too. Just so much to consume.
Oh, you
So
haven't
much
seen it yet?
media,
Oh,
so
okay.
much stuff out
Um,
there.
yeah, check it out, and we'll touch base whether it's in the Dream Center or another
Mhm.
talk. Like, I'm curious.
Yeah, but
Um,
I'm always that type of person. I was like, I do like Dave Chappelle. What I've heard sounds very dicey, but I shouldn't, as an individual, I feel, and I always tell people to do this too. It's like you need to just watch it, right?
mhm.
Same thing with the whole Joker, Joaquin Phoenix Joker, right? Is that, yeah, you can hear the controversy, but until you actually see it, you should have an opinion about it, right?
You mean that Joker right there?
No, Joaquin Phoenix is, yeah.
Oh, the Joaquin
Oh,
Phoenix. Oh, just kidding.
yeah, with all the controversy that came out about white violence and all of these things, I was just like, well,
Uh,
I think there's more. Like after I watched it, it wasn't necessarily white violence for me. It's like it was media that was the enemy, more
mhm.
so than Joaquin Phoenix's character to some degree,
Yeah,
because it took,
and a
yeah.
cold world, right?
Mm-hmm,
A cold world that isolates people. Inability to treat mental health, or people with mental illness,
mm-hmm,
a whole lot of things. But
yeah.
that's when you have that lens, when you look for it, like Chris Rock has a joke many years ago. Like he got into this mode where it's like he'd walk into the room and like, all right, where's the racism? Where's the racism at?
Mm-hmm,
And he kind of like got him very angry for a period of his life, and he if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've seen it. He kind of learns how to kind of get away from that a little bit and just take things in a little bit more openly.
and then I
And
think,
then,
yeah, I think part of it is being measured. I think that there is, I hope, like, times in which we can outrage, right? There are
mhm.
times that, you know, we can fight these battles, but sometimes it's like you need to look inward as an individual and say, is this fight worth fighting for, to some degree? And I'm not trying to say that in defense of Dave Chappelle, but like I think in the general space, on a case by case basis, is this something that I'm willing to put myself towards, this issue? I think for me
Yeah.
it's always been, being of service to other students, being of service to, um even my aging parents, right? They're in their 60s and 70s, right? Like being a service to them, like they're my priority. Like what is those battles that I want to fight, right? you know
Well, and to your previous point, like, what's it going to look like? Well, maybe we're moving in a direction where we understand that um, this little rectangle of glass and plastic and metal um, is doing something to the way we think,
hmm
and maybe we start to create something different. Like maybe, like, I think about how vinyl's big now, like people going back to a more analog world, because there's a hunger for it. Maybe
hmm
that's where we move when it comes to information as well. Maybe not. We'll see. But
I just
I
hope
mean,
to,
like,
yeah.
dude, we were fine with Chappelle making fun of white people. We're fine with
Hmm.
Chappelle making fun of, conservatives and things like that. Well, it's just jokes, and that's the job of the comedian.
Hmm.
When it's people out in the world and they think they can do that, well, okay, I take issue with that. You know what I mean? It's like,
Definitely.
yeah, you're not a comedian. This is not the time and place.
Hmm.
There's no stage lights, and that's part of the problem. It's like,
Hmm.
um, it's why we can't have nice things sometimes, right? um, but uh, like that's part of his message too. Like the need for this space for the comedian to exist. It's a
Hmm.
tradition that's goes back far in history. Like the court jester was his job was to humble the king, right?
Hmm.
He was the one that could make fun of the king so he could be humbled. I've heard in ancient Rome they would have someone that would. I might be misremembering this a bit, but like that would constantly remind Caesar, like someday you will die.
Hmm.
Like, that's his job, to humble.
Hmm.
Um, and what happens when we're not humbled? Well, horrible things can happen when people in power are not humble.
Well, I think that's where the id, or like the I think the darkest natures of human beings can come manifest. I think, sometimes I don't think that is like um, a good thing, to see that, because we've seen leaders do that. I think my parents were survivors of a
Mm,
man that thought he could use history in the context to bring him power, right? If you know anything about Cambodian history, it's just like he thought himself as one of those god kings to a degree, and
mm.
he never got justice for that. You know, like he never faced any repercussions. He lived out his rest of his life.
Well,
And
it's
yeah,
an idea as old as history
right.
that power corrupts people. So we need to be careful about um, the amount of power we give people,
Hmm.
or how we fall. Like Plato wrote about that stuff, 2,000 plus years ago, and here we are. There's a cult of Donald Trump. There's
Hmm.
people who openly say, like, it doesn't matter what he says, I'm all about it, and that that's dangerous. And I think, uh, is there an element of that on the other side of the argument, on the other side of the aisle, or the dichotomy, whatever we want to call it?
Hmm.
I think
Yeah.
maybe it's not a person, but it's more of a, I don't know. It's hard to speculate. It's hard to theorize, obviously, but um,
Well, I think because we are of a similar community, so I think it's hard to kind of even look critically at ourselves sometimes. I think
mm,
as a group, as a collective, right? I think it's so much easier to say that's the enemy, right?
mm.
But pointing the finger at ourselves, it's like it's hard, right? We could say, well, these are some of the aspects that we don't like about ourselves and things like that. Or like for
Yeah, so
me,
I guess to
yeah.
that point, I think what I was trying to say is like there's a certain vanity in that has injected itself into, in
Hmm.
my view at least, into the social justice movement. Like sometimes I've heard it called virtue signaling.
Hmm.
Like, look at me, I'm such a good person. I do X, Y, and Z, and I'm gonna
Hmm.
post it on Instagram. Um, and and if you don't see it my way, I'm gonna slander you on the internet. I'm gonna make funny memes about you, all that stuff. Um,
You're like hitting on the nail for me. It's like every time I post something, I'm always super hyper aware. It's
yeah.
like, am I doing this for my social credit in my mind's eye, or is it something that, hey, I'm actually super proud of, like this, like I just literally about right before this podcast happened, like I was saying, hey, I'm very proud of the students and the work that we did to do this event
Mhm.
this past Saturday. This is like, I know this is like a throwback Thursday sort of thing, but I think to some degree it's like for some people they'll see that and say, oh, this guy's just trying to find social credit. But to
Mhm.
me it's like I wanted to pass that microphone to other people on my account to make sure that like they don't seem ignored.
Yeah,
And it's
and
really
and
hard. Yeah.
it is hard, and for me, like I'm the guy. I don't have social media. I never have. Um, I like to do things without putting my name on it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I don't like that kind of attention. I'm kind of a private dude. Um, so even to get to a point where I'm on a podcast,
Mm-hmm.
or it is me kind of forcing myself,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but also through a recognition that sometimes the good work demands publicity to
Mm-hmm.
continue, right? So ultimately, like you got to decide for yourself: are you doing it out of a good intention? And from what I know about you, I'd say yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right? And but to constantly ask yourself that question, I think is healthy,
Yeah.
because someday it might come the day that it's like it is vanity, or it is attention seeking.
It's vanity,
Um,
it could be ego. I
yeah.
think for the longest time, for when I was in college, I had a lot of that, right? There's this
Mm,
vanity and this ego where it's like, I'm gonna go out and change the world. But it's like, to some degree, it's like I need to put that, there's work that needs to be done before doing that, right? And
oh
I
yeah.
think I need to humble myself and just say, I'm not gonna try to be showy, because I need to make sure that I'm actually doing the things that I say,
Mhm.
putting that best foot forward, right? And always by living through that code. And I think that through that, I felt like I really changed. It's just I wanted to
Yeah.
make sure that, like, I think whatever comes out, it's always genuine. It's always something that I could go back, like maybe 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line in my retirement, and say, you know what, I'm actually very proud of that.
Yeah.
But not in a narcissistic way, but more in a way it's like, this is like the impact, these are the people that I've influenced. I get to look at that, not in like a negative, not, I wouldn't say negative way, but in a way that like too showy, right?
No, that's I had a very formative experience in college at Cal State
Mm-hmm.
LA. I'm Latino. I'm mixed Mexican American. My mom's from Nicaragua, Nicaraguan American. Um, I'm light skinned, right? um, I'm from East LA, but I don't have that sort of stereotypical East LA accent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I go into the Mecha office at Cal State LA in the student union, and I'm at a place where like I'm starting to study history, and I'm thinking much more critically and be like more culturally aware of my roots and exploring that.
Mm-hmm.
And I found out about Mecha, and I'm interested. I'm like, this is cool. Like, and the guy, I don't remember his name, but he basically told me this is not for me,
Mm-hmm.
because he very specifically said my parents didn't work in the fields. And I was like, and he kind of made a comment about my skin, and I was like, well, my parents worked in the sweatshops in downtown LA back when the garment industry was centered here before globalization sent it in other places. And, I'm the son of a
Mm-hmm.
tailor. Um,
Same.
really? Oh,
Yeah,
that's
my
interesting.
my my mom, my mom.
That's really interesting. That's cool. Small world.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and that was just like, why? Here I am. Like, why is he excluding me?
It's
And
gatekeeping.
and
Yeah.
in my view, like that was his vanity. This is
Mm-hmm.
this is such an integral part of his identity that he can't share it with the likes of me,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't fit exactly what he wants me to be. And that's the understanding I have now carried forward into, I guess, a critical view of the current manifestation of like the social justice movement. Um,
Right.
because I think, in my view, in my humble opinion, like I said, that's what got Donald Trump elected.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what, or at least a good part of that, this backlash, right? Logical or not, factual or not, um, that, and gerrymandering and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But like I said, there's a lot of imperfect allies out there. Like, not what I said, what Dave Chappelle said. There's a lot of imperfect allies out there that
on
should
a political standpoint.
should
Yeah.
should be on our side, but they're
Mm-hmm.
not, right? So
Yeah.
that's the world we're looking at. And it's confusing.
Yeah. That and like on an academic sense, it's like um for me, some of the most formative like teachers are like long dead, but also like these philosophers that really helped me kind of like be more empathic, or like looking into some of the things that I criticize myself, but also at the same point, like work towards like understanding, right? Like Susan Sontag, right? And I know this is like super basic, like surface level research, but I had some trouble just being a photographer during like these like very critical events, right? You know, like housing and
I don't know who Susan Sontag is. Can you
oh,
can
I
you give
think
me
she's
context?
like a social critic, and
Okay.
she talked about photography. Her thing was photography, but she talked about how capturing the moment doesn't exclude you from being in that like space, right? Because I think for me, I felt like I was in that moment. It's like I'm capturing it, but I could also be more involved in that moment, right? Like be helping out, you know, if it was like sort of like that social uprising, like BLM, right? I could be, if something were to happen, I could help somebody out, right?
Mhm.
Instead of that, I'm just taking pictures. Is that wrong of me to do that, right? Is that
Sure.
wrong of me to take pictures when I could actually actively help a hand? And she comes in and says, you know, you are in that moment. You are part of that capturing of that event. You are in it, and
Hmm.
you shouldn't be devoiding yourself of that. And I think that was the idea that I got out of it. It was Lofthouse that got me into like this author, this person that's also a photographer, to
Hmm.
kind of help me out of that, because I was just kind of like I was like uber empathic, right? Just kind of like
Hmm.
I it got to a point. It's like, should I really take up this photography, this writing thing? But it got me to a point where I can actively work to a degree. I know I kind of
Interesting.
mumbled my way through that.
No, no, no. I'm. It's given me a lot to think about. I think, like my first reaction is that if you're there as a photographer documenting this event, then having that distance, keeping that camera rolling, is important work.
Mm-hmm.
And and it depends. What are the details? Like, are you saying somebody fell and is being trampled, then you could do something about it. Well, so could 100 other people.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you documenting that is what makes it so that later on it doesn't happen again because of some other reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there's a value to that the role of the watcher, the role of the recorder, the role of the historian,
Mm-hmm.
um, because even that, like those pictures are going to be used, and those pictures will live on and be part of a narrative of history that's really important.
Yeah, yeah. And even around that same time, I even like think about like Rolling Stone and Hunter S. Thompson, you know, like this idea of gonzo journalism, like being the story. And
Mm-hmm.
like I think you know, I don't know if they would have been friends, but like I think it's one stone's throw away of that same philosophy. You are part of that story. You are, you know, bringing that knowledge to people, right? And I think now I'm starting to understand that more. Even though I was never classically trained as a journalist, I was never classically trained as a writer. It's like I am understanding like to be there means that you have to like actually be there, not just taking photos and, you know, writing your piece, writing that article, right?
Mm-hmm. I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure. What do they
Yeah.
teach you in journalism school? Are they
Never
more of
been,
the
but
but do you know, like, are they more of the, like, you're the impartial recorder, like the watcher, and the watcher in his code, right?
yeah, I think that
Um,
there's like this I've heard before that there's this idea, this vanity of like we have to be unbiased, but I think that to some degree, and I think there's a lot of um people that haven't gone through that training that says like I think that there is to a degree that sometimes your politics can be integrated into your story, right?
mhm,
The way you see things. And I think that the notion of being unbiased is that idea that we had earlier. It's like that is the vanity, that is that ego, right?
mhm,
This notion of like you're not gonna be offending anybody by just stating the facts.
mm. I see what you mean.
Yeah. And I
I
think
think,
yeah.
in my view, it's like I think there's definitely a place to strive for. It's an ideal. You're never gonna reach it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a place to strive for it, and then there's a place to abandon it.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to, and that's the nuance, and you have to make that judgment call, and sometimes you'll be wrong.
I think journalists are just as much as artists that artists are, right? I think it is kind of, it's not objective, it can be subjective, you know, to some degree.
That's tough. Like I know, Malcolm Gladwell. He one of his podcasts. He's looking at. There's a very famous photo from the civil rights movement of this German Shepherd dog attacking this young black man who's kind of almost paralyzed with fear, kind of on his
Mm-hmm.
knees. And there's like a sheriff, and the sheriff's got the dog on the leash. And for a long time, that picture was presented as, here's this cop sicking the dog on this young black man for being part of this protest. And the actual story behind it is the opposite. Like, if I'm remembering correctly, they're actually like friends now in life, because
Mm-hmm.
the controversy around this photo and the narrative that was constructed around this photo became that, you know, evil cop, civil rights activist. Um, that's an easy, easy target, right? Easy
Mm-hmm.
target to hate. Uh, that picture was inaccurate
Mm-hmm.
for that narrative, and that doesn't, like, that doesn't disqualify the civil rights movement or feelings around it, but it's just like, hey, that one thing, uh, our understanding of it is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and we got to acknowledge that. And so I would probably disagree with what you're saying. Like, the role of the journalist, as much as possible, is to try to
Mm-hmm.
adhere to that non-biased type of perspective, because
Mm-hmm.
that's where you get more truth.
Yeah, it
But the
is.
the artist is not, to me, in my view, the artist, that's something else. The artist
Mm-hmm.
is, they're making a statement about it.
Mm-hmm.
The history teacher too, but the history teacher is more a curator,
Mm-hmm.
and I've always taken it from the perspective of, like, I'm not trying to convince them of a particular narrative,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't remember who said this to me, but it stuck with me, hit me like a punch in the gut. If I can convince a student of something, then somebody else can convince them of the opposite. But if I can teach them to weigh uh, factual information and think about things in an ethical point of view, and and really become their own, like examine their own moral compass, then in the end, in the long run, that's how we build a better world.
Right.
Because that's my optimism. Within everybody there is good,
Okay.
and we have to help them find it sometimes,
Mm.
right? And within everybody there is humanity, and we have to help people recognize the humanity in each other.
I'm starting to realize I might have a jaded view of things.
Oh, you and me both, man. No,
Yeah,
I'm
I
with you.
get.
I'm
Well,
with
yeah.
you. But it's also like,
It gives me a
maybe
lot to
that's the
think.
vanity, right?
Yeah.
Like,
It gives. Mm-hmm.
um, this notion of, like, I'm right about everything. Everything's so fucked up. Um, they just don't see it like me. But maybe
Mm-hmm.
people surprise you, and if I'm gonna continue to do this work and try to build towards a better world, it has to be through a stubborn uh, unwillingness to accept
Mm-hmm.
that cynicism, right?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
That's fair. I was thinking that up. Oh, darn, it gives me a lot to think about right now, because I did have this notion. I guess this is part of my pessimism, is just thinking, that I've just been fed a certain thing, and I just have this sense feeling that certain authors or journalists just has a specific thing that they wanted to focus on, right?
Mm.
And I think that there, to some extent, a lot of what I was brought around is just like this idea that, I think that maybe you try to strive for unbiased, you try to strive for saying the facts, but I think in my mind, it was like it can never necessarily be objective. Sometimes there's going to be a lot of the subjective that's going to be in there too, you know. And I think
I agree.
what helps me is just being, because of that kind of like nihilism, or like that kind of pessimism, is that I try to make sure to, like, whatever the issue, just try to read as much as possible, or at least get the idea of the full story, right? Because getting an idea of something through one article is not being informed about it, right? It takes more than just that one article. It takes more than just being inside of a bubble to get an idea of how.
You know, and if we're talking about like consumption of media, if you do find those sources that have built up trust over time, then you can rely on that as just the one thing that you're going to go to, at least to start with, and then you have to look at it logically. And does this add up? And then if it doesn't add up, then maybe I need to start looking at other analyses of a thing. But yeah, and that's part of the. I mean, we kind of talked about that earlier. There's so much information. It's so difficult, and the way information has been monetized is complicates it even further, right?
Yeah, we recently had Facebook, right? Like this idea that they've promoted a lot of things because it was financially
good for their bottom line.
Good for their bottom line, and it wasn't necessarily
bad for the world.
It wasn't good for democracy. It wasn't good for, social good, right? I think I run a lot of very social good, like, groups on my Facebook, right? But my Facebook is not the same thing as, say, for example, an elder's Facebook, right? Who gets fed certain things from an algorithm, right? And that's really harsh. I think that's a harsh reality, right? I think whatever you clicks on, you may look like in your own bubble that this is what you see and everything is all fine and dandy, right? But like going off to other people, you could get the flat earthers, you can get the January 6th was just an inside job, you get all of those weird things that are
or peaceful protests
or peaceful protests, right? And like you get the thing of like now this is a zeitgeist, right? This is the thing. And I think part of my negativity, and I think this is like a long conversation in a way of, I think we both understand, I think to some degree, like we're on the same wavelength, but I think for me it's just like I think I probably have a much more distress in like media, and I think to my mind I still trying to reconcile that. I think 20 years of a war that may or may not have been a place that we need to be at, right, jaded me, right? I may not had the cognitive idea to really understand it as an adult that would live through that, but like I still live with the consequences of that, whether not good or bad, right? So I think I might be realizing I might be jaded more. I thought I was an optimist.
Well, you know what though, like the test is, are you going to show up to the Dream Center tomorrow, or are you going to keep working with those kids?
Oh, that's true.
And you're going to keep striving, and if you're doing that, then feel what you feel, but you're doing what you're doing. Right. And because you feel it one week doesn't mean it's going to be next week. That's where I've learned to check myself as a teacher, because there's been times it's like, oh boy, you can despair, and like we talked about earlier, and then there's the times where you feel like, oh, this is why I'm doing this. This is why I'm doing my job. So being able to push through those lows becomes vital. Right.
Mentioned it before. I remember how I was feeling when January 6th happened. When all of that went down, I was just like, oh, that's crazy. Oh shoot, I gotta face my students.
I was in class
when that was happening.
and
yeah.
And distance learning on Zoom, and my
Mm-hmm.
phone's blowing up, and I was like, whoa, like I switched over to like live YouTube, and my kids were watching this together, and I honestly don't remember. I think I might be misremembering it, but I think I ended class early,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of told them, like let's watch this.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. That's very cool. Uh, and then I just watched TV the rest of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I was taking it in, and we started brainstorming in our department, like what do we do tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
And like in our department, we actually kind of collectively formed this little spreadsheet with resources. We were posting like news clips, we were posting articles,
Mm-hmm.
and oddly enough, somehow news of that gets up to like district officials on high,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the press people in the district interviewed me at some point
Mm-hmm.
about it, and I actually have the little thing from Alhambra's got a little newsletter,
Oh
um,
yeah.
community newsletter. So I'll send you the screenshot of it, so
Mm-hmm.
you can check it out. And what I talked about was sort of the need to in the classroom model like how to have civil discourse and civil disagreement, because we
Mm-hmm.
don't, the need for that today is just more than ever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't know, that was kind of a tangent,
A little bit of a
but
tangent, but also I think it goes back to probably like I think throughout our two podcast conversation is like I think even in the differences that we may have, like I am pretty sure a lot of different guests that I have, we might have differences of opinions, but I think is within those differences that we learn, right?
mhm,
Like I learned a lot through our conversations these past 2 weeks that that like I digest and really thought about, right? And I think it's through this host and guest kind of relationship. I think that's, and even beyond that, like that's where learning happens, right? I
mhm.
think that there's a much more worldly, like for me in my mind, I in this minute moment in time, like I think I'm a different Bryan than I was about an hour ago, you
Oh, that's
know.
cool.
And I think to some degree, if at least as from an educator to a student standpoint, you would probably want to strive that. Like you have a student in that moment in time, in your 45 minutes where you have that student, you've changed that student's not mind, but like their way, wouldn't say way of thinking, way of approaching things. It could be a bit of information that they didn't have to dwell on, and from that beginning of that hour to that last like
Mhm.
5 minutes, right? It's a lot, right? It's a lot to take in, and I think this might be one of the more intense conversations because I think that I have to like listen and check myself, more so. But I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think it's refreshing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we all should. I mean, that's
Hmm.
sort of one of the realizations that I've had in my life and career. Like I've learned so much teaching,
Hmm.
um, and that's one of the big ones. Patience, humility, empathy. These are
Hmm.
all things that you know, poets and philosophers and artists have strived for throughout history.
Hmm.
And it's always been elusive, right? And like you hold it for a minute and it goes away the next day. And,
all all that being said, uh, what are you, I think, kind of closing out, because I just saw the time about a second
oh
ago.
wow, yeah.
But to our point about this, all of this, discussion about history and like how to be a better person, do you, do you, in the most broadest sense, feel optimism, right? That,
Hmm.
I think to some degree people are more aware. I think more students are like wanting to understand these things. I think to some degree it's like for some of them it's like this whole council culture is like not necessarily something that they want to kind of like
Mhm.
have their admit the claim admissions to, like
Mhm.
like the social justice theme park is like, yeah, that's not the ride that I'm gonna go on.
Mhm.
So I think uh, do you feel optimistic about this next 10 years of education that students are going to get?
Um, I'd say most of the time I do.
Mm-hmm.
And by most, maybe 55%.
55. So it's a it's
uh,
a it's a 50 plus 1 equation that we're having here.
yeah, yeah. And like I said, the test is getting up in the morning and going to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
So the day that I feel the work is futile, I will stop.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not in this for just a paycheck. I made that promise to myself many years ago, and yeah. So and it's the the alliances we form, the people we meet that are willing to put in the work,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately, like the work is in just expanding human dignity, right, and expanding the circle of community to more and more people.
And it's like the community we foster, right? I
Yeah.
think that's the other thing that I would probably put like a little sprinkle of is that with the work that I've done with the Dream Center is like building that. What is that beyond high school community? Because I
Mm,
think a lot of students feel that once high school is over, I'm done. This is my commitment to society. After that, I'm got to get my paycheck, right? But I think there's more to that, and I think hopefully what I bring to the table is a sense of community, right? Of a shared understanding of like, I may be Asian, you may be of a Chicano background, right? But we can still have similar experience, we can have similar wants and needs, we can have similar um you know goals and aspirations, right? And
mm,
that's in itself, that's a community. And
mm,
hopefully, and that what brings me into that dream center space is that hope of building that out and building like a framework where that could also continue, and if it needs to be like changed. So hopefully that's
mm.
my imperfect document.
I like it.
Yeah. So thank you again for being on the podcast.
Well, thanks for
Uh,
having me. Appreciate it.
I,
It's
you
fun.
know what? If you definitely want to ever come on again, have a discussion. And I think I've learned a lot, even in the second hour and a
Well,
half.
I think we ran out of things to talk about. I think. No, just
I
we're gonna have to wait another year or two. I'm
a
just
year
kidding.
of experience, a year of worldly journeys.
Or litany of tragedies out in the world, but let's hope it's the good one.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, thank you again for being on this podcast. For you, the audience, hope you like what we do and continue to watch. Until then, we'll see you. All right. Bye, Mr. Hadagi. Or David.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.